And welcome to another edition of Flashpoints on Washington Unplugged. I'm Bob Orr, along with Juan Zarate, our national security analyst. Juan, it's been a monumental day in Egypt. I mean, a real cataclysm there as President Mubarak steps down. There are parties in the street, but the military looks like it's in control for the moment. What happens now?
Well, I think that's the big question. In a historic day, a day where we saw a street revolution take down a 30-year leader, an autocrat in Egypt, Mubarak is gone. But I think the real question and the real friction actually starts now. The question of what happens now that the military is in control, and are they going to lead a process that leads to an open, democratic, pluralistic Egyptian state? Or do we see something else? Do we see something where the political powers that be, the folks who are still there and present, folks like Vice President Suleiman, try to co-opt the process in some way and don't allow the kind of opening that the protesters have called for? The other side of the equation is, are the protesters satiated? They've met their initial principal demand, that Mubarak step down. But in essence, that's not all that they're protesting for. They're protesting for political openness, economic opportunity, social change, really. And so the departure of Mubarak is an important and historic step and a symbolic one, but it doesn't solve some of these underlying issues. And so how the military takes the reins here and how they run the process toward a more open, democratic, pluralistic system is really the complicating factor and the big question now.
There are multiple problems here, though. You have a military institution, obviously connected to the old regime, and now we're trusting the military to run a democratic reform process?
You've hit the nail on the head. I think a lot of observers have cautioned in giving too much credit to the military. I mean, this is a military that has been behind the regime for 3 decades. And I think it's still up in the air as to where the military is going to take things. I think the public pressure and the international pressure is clear that we're going to see a system and a process that leads to open democratic elections, one that is open even to the Muslim Brotherhood and even to groups that have been outlawed in the past, giving voice to the street protesters. But I'm not sure that the military has necessarily made that final calculus yet. And so no doubt the Obama administration, others around the world, are going to try to influence how the military, the Egyptian military, is thinking about these issues, and will help guide them along so that they actually lead to an election either soon, within 60 days, or in the fall, that leads to something that looks like what the protesters want. But I think we've got to be cautious here because the military is now in control. Some could call this a military coup d'etat on the shoulders of the street protests. Are they going to take the voice of the protesters as they move this along, or are they going to be the classic military that we've seen over the last 3 decades? The jury's still out.
It brings us to our first flashpoint of the day, and that is in what now is essentially a vacuum. We don't know what's going to come out the other end of the pipeline. What risk is there that the government of Egypt could fall into the hands of some kind of radical group or be influenced greatly by some kind of radical group?
Well, I think a major debate now is in the context of this power vacuum with Mubarak gone, how do the extreme elements in Egyptian society, which there are, everything from the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, which forms a core part of Al-Qaeda, to more moderate elements of the Islamist Party, Muslim Brotherhood, which has been outlawed. What role do they play? Do they try to take full advantage of this current environment? For example, does Al-Qaeda try to send operatives in? Do they try to take some of the people who've escaped from prison and begin to operate in North Africa more aggressively? Does the Muslim Brotherhood veil its ultimate goals of an Islamist state in Egypt and try to gain power slowly but surely through whatever process emerges? These are critical questions. One of the interesting things is you started to see the Muslim Brotherhood go on a PR offensive. Yesterday in the United States, there was an op-ed in the New York Times and an op-ed in the Washington Post from the Muslim Brotherhood leadership trying to influence the elite's opinion in the United States, trying to say we're not a threat, we're part of the process, and in fact, we're not even going to put a presidential candidate up. But I think the jury's still out as to what the Muslim Brotherhood wants, in part because the Muslim Brotherhood may not know itself.
There's even a debate among our leaders here in this country, our intelligence leaders, about whether or not the Muslim Brotherhood was a violent organization. We heard yesterday The DNI clappers say no, not in Egypt. But the FBI Director Mueller said, well, they do violent things or stand for violent things overseas. So we don't really know who these guys are.
No, this is the difficulty with the Muslim Brotherhood. It tends to be a shadowy organization, well organized since the late 1920s, based in Egypt, but with a global network. Their Palestinian franchise, in essence, is Hamas, the violent extremist terrorist group, as so labeled by the U.S. and the European Union. And so it has various branches around the world, various networks that operate globally. Its political form in Egypt has been nonviolent in name for a number of years, and they've disavowed the use of violence, which is good. But there's a question of who's actually running the Muslim Brotherhood. Is it the more extreme Islamist elements that really want an Islamist Egyptian state, that don't want peace with Israel, that want Sharia as the basis of Egyptian law? Or the more moderate folks, like the leader we heard in the Washington Post editorial yesterday, who's a younger leader, more reform-minded, more modernist, wants to have the Muslim Brotherhood be a part of the Egyptian society. So I think the confusion you hear from American officials' voices is actually a confusion and a reflection of the complexity of the Muslim Brotherhood, both globally and then within Egypt.
It's going to be very, very interesting to watch how all of that plays out. Let's go to item number 2, and that is something that a lot of people aren't aware of, and that is that the Nasdaq stock exchange has been infiltrated, hacked.
The Nasdaq was hacked, and I think an interesting demonstration of the 21st century threats that we face, both in terms of cyber crime and cyber vulnerabilities, but also in terms of economic vulnerabilities. When so much of, for example, online trading and Nasdaq trading is handled automatically, digitally, using some of these systems, it is incredibly frightening to think that you have people able to hack into the system. Now, the good news is they didn't hack into the actual trading system, and Nasdaq has been very clear about that. That would be very damaging to Nasdaq's reputation. So they didn't get into the trading system itself, but they got into the web-based system that actually has portals and the ability for companies that list themselves on the Nasdaq to share and store and file information. And what's interesting was they found these files, and it looks like they're probably Trojan horses in a sense of allowing for additional probes and additional malware to be put in the future into the system. And so that's really dangerous.
Do we know if this was just some kind of mischief, some kind of online vandalism, or were these serious probes to try to set up some kind of serious attack later?
Well, indications are that this came from Russia. Now, as we know in the cyber world, where something comes from, whether it's a penetration or malware or some sort of attack, doesn't necessarily mean that that's the real point of origin, because cyber vigilantes, hackers, etc., can mask their operations easily, use different servers in different parts of the world to actually hide and mask their identity. So I don't think we know quite yet. We know the Secret Service was onto this early. The FBI is now has been brought in to look at it, and I think the theories range from this was just some very sophisticated folks, hackers who were trying to see what they could do with a sophisticated system like the Nasdaq's, to real penetration by, for example, foreign service or an international organized crime group, for example, that actually wants to try to manipulate at some point the prices and the tradings that go on via the Nasdaq, potentially not only disrupt the U.S., but also to make profit.
There's almost always a flashpoint to talk about in Pakistan, and there is one now, with an American there in custody, a consular official accused of murder, I guess. How serious is this?
Well, the reason I wanted to talk about it is, as you said, there's always something brewing in Pakistan. But the reason this is important is it's caused a lot of tension between the United States and Pakistan. This is a U.S. official, I think termed an attaché of some sort, named Raymond Davis, who shot two Pakistani policemen. He says he was approached and he thought he was being robbed. This, unfortunately, is a tragic comedy of errors, because not only did he shoot two individuals, two Pakistanis, but the car that was sent to rescue him from being arrested actually ran over somebody else and killed them as well. And so this whole series of events was really a tragedy happening and unfolding. The problem now is the U.S. government wants him released. He's a diplomat. Under the Vienna Convention, he has diplomatic immunity. Right, unless the United States waives it. The Pakistani government says, not so fast. He's committed a crime, potentially. The courts have to decide his status, and we're not going to honor his diplomatic status as of yet. This has caused a lot of diplomatic friction. You've heard rumblings from the State Department about this. And this has the potential. This is the kind of incident that does serve as a flashpoint that really could upset the balance of a relationship, where in Pakistan there's already a lot of anti-American sentiment. And so this just has the potential to create further fissures between the Pakistani government and the U.S.
At a minimum, he could be a pawn here in some kind of greater strategic point.
Absolutely. They could make this, make him not only a piñata in terms of a political discourse, but they could try to make him an example in terms of holding America accountable for what it does in Pakistan.
Our fourth point is a country, Sudan, who we talked about for a long time now. There's a brand new country.
Yep. And we talked about it before the new year. We said we are likely to see the birth of a new nation after the referendum in Southern Sudan. The returns are mostly back, and the return has now been accepted by the Sudanese government. Over 98%, almost 99% of the votes were cast in favor of secession and statehood. So we will come this summer see the birth of a new nation, Southern Sudan. I'm not sure what they're going to call it. There's all sorts of debates.
We don't have
There's
a
all
name
sorts
yet.
of debates. No, but for now it's Southern Sudan. The interesting thing here is that it's gone relatively peacefully. Both the vote was peaceful and the acceptance of the vote from the government in Khartoum was accepted, and it's gone peacefully. That is remarkable, because you could imagine all sorts of scenarios, and we talked about them for violence. Now, that said, there are still issues at play. There's still territorial questions. There's still oil revenue questions. There's still questions as to how the Southern Sudanese are going to get their oil out. They're going to have to deal with the Northern Sudanese now. So there's all sorts of questions left to talk about. That said, this is a good news story, I think, and it's why we're ending this Flashpoints with
Well, we have a new country being born and an old country that's being kind of reinvented.
That's right, and actually it's a great point, Bob, because I think this will be a moment for a reinvigoration of U.S.-Sudanese relations, Northern Sudanese relations. You will see perhaps that country come off the state sponsor of terror list, and you will see an attempt to bring Northern Sudan back into the fold a bit with this move.
All right, well, that'll do it for Flashpoint this week. Juan, thanks as always.
Thank you, Bob.
See you next time.